Alrighty, I'm pleased to be joined by a reoccurring guest, Brad Fowler of the Pint Football Podcast. Thanks for coming on again, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Excited to talk some ball with you.
Yeah, and again, you came on, I guess it's been a few months now. I think it was close to, February? So it's been a few months since you last talked. But again, thanks for coming on a short notice. I know that there's some people that probably know about, or there's some people that listen to my podcast that know about your podcast or whatever, because you came on the one time, and your listeners are probably listening as well. But for the people who just started listening, can you tell more about your podcast before we kind of start talking about the NFL season?
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, so like you said, I'm the host of Pint Football Podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all the players that you would normally listen to podcasts. It's a weekly show. We talk NFL and college football, all things, news, notes, break down games, betting lines, try to go in depth, give you guys lots of good information. And going in season 4 now. Hard to believe it's been that long. It's been a lot of fun, and getting ready for the regular season. College football right around the corner, NFL not too far behind it. It's going to be a lot of fun to start breaking down games.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot about college football. College football actually starts before the NFL season, so I think that starts in only a few weeks. So that's crazy. And of course, right now there's some preseason games going on as we're recording right now. Let's just go into it right now. So the Detroit Lions, of course, are on Hard Knocks. That's kind of the big story right now. The Lions are a team that, if you're not a fan of any other team in the NFC North, like the Packers, Vikings, or the Bears, you're probably somewhat cheering for the Lions, right? Because they've had some disappointing years. And now with Dan Campbell in his second year, a lot of people love Dan Campbell. But what have you thought about Hard Knocks so far? And is there anything that's really shocked you so far in the show?
Nothing really shocking. I think when I look at Dan Campbell and watch him, and you kind of get the behind the scenes glimpse of him, I get the sense that he's a real big rah-rah kind of coach. And I think we knew that when he got hired. The whole biting kneecaps press conference when he got hired, and some of the things that come out of his mouth are almost a little shocking. He's not the most buttoned up coach, so to speak, but he wears his heart on his sleeve. He's a passionate guy. You can tell he's a fired up guy. He's a guy that's really has his players, I think, that playing hard for him. If you look at last year, this is a team that really didn't have a lot of talent. They had a lot of holes on this roster, and they were in a lot of games. They didn't win a lot of games, but they were competitive. And I think it says a lot about him, his mentality, and what type of team he's trying to build there. So from that standpoint, I think you've got to be excited for what he's building. I don't know if it's going to last long-term. Rah-rah coaches tend to kind of burn out. I'd like to see more X's and O's improvement from him this season. But as far as like watching him in the show and kind of getting a glimpse of him, it's been interesting for sure. You get the mentality that we know he's a former player, but boy, it really comes across when you're watching him like working out with the team and doing some of the things that he did at practice in the Hard Knocks. It's surprising. I don't think a lot of coaches are taking the angle that he takes.
Yeah, it seems like Dan Campbell kind of reminds a lot of people of Mike Vrabel of the Titans, where he shows a lot. Like I said, as you mentioned, he shows a lot of emotions. He's not really an X's and O's guy, but he's definitely there. You can definitely tell he wants to win. Detroit, as you mentioned too, Detroit was in most of games last year. They probably should have beat the Ravens if it wasn't for Justin Tucker being the greatest kicker of all time. They did beat the Packers late in the year. They blew out the Cardinals. They beat the Vikings on literally the last second. So I think this Lions team is going to be better last year. I don't know if they're going to make the playoffs. A lot of people do. Do you think Detroit makes the playoffs this year?
I don't think so. I think when I look at it, Vegas has the over-under win total for them right now at 6.5. It's hard for me to think that a team that went 3-13, or I should say 3-13-1, is going to make the playoffs. I mean, that's a big jump to get from that to the playoffs. But if you look at that over-under win total, if Vegas thinks that they're maybe a 6 or 7 win team, that's a big improvement. If they get to 6 wins, that's doubling their win total. And that's a great improvement for this team. I thought they had a nice draft. I thought they really have upgraded the roster, especially in some key spots where they needed to. And like I said, this is a team that really plays hard for Dan Campbell. So it's going to be interesting. I think this is a team that's going to show some improvement this year. I'd be surprised if they were the number 2 pick in the draft again, or, even a top 3 pick. I think this is the team that maybe gets out and wins a few of those games that they didn't quite pull off last year. maybe they get to 6 or 7 wins and start moving in the right direction. And I think for Lions fans, that's all you can really hope for.
Yeah, and I think too their division isn't super tough. They do have the Packers, which are probably going to win the division again, and they do have the Vikings, who not a lot of people are talking about, but they're probably definitely better than the Bears, and especially what they're dealing with right now. I think they're better than the Bears, but to make the playoffs, I feel like that's a bit of a stretch. I think I have them predicted to go 7-10 and be in most of the games. I could see them beating the Packers once, but I think it'd be hard for them to go into Lambeau. I think if they end up beating the Packers, it's probably going to be in Detroit. I could see them sweeping the Bears, but I think making the playoffs is a bit of a stretch, but the NFC isn't as stacked as the AFC, right? So I could see them making making a little bit of a run, but the playoffs is very hard to see, even with the 7 teams now. But the one position I'm not really big on with Detroit is their quarterback position. I don't think Jared Goff is good enough to lead the Lions to the playoffs. And Detroit seems very confident in Jared Goff. They didn't draft any quarterback. They didn't even draft one the 3rd or 4th or 5th round. I think they brought back Tim Boyle and David Blau. Do you think Jared Goff, I mean, I know he was the number 1 pick at one time, but he was not very good last year for the most part. Do you think do you think Jared Goff is the guy for Detroit, or what do you think about Jared Goff in general?
Well, I think he's an okay quarterback. I think he's kind of a middle of the road guy. I think if he has the right pieces around him, like we saw in LA there for a while, if he's got the right pieces around him, I think he can have success. And that's really the majority of quarterbacks in the NFL. That's kind of the group they're in. They need everything around them to be at least above average for them to have success. And he kind of falls into that group. I don't think he's a terrible quarterback by any means. I'm not sure he's a guy that can take him to the promised land or anything like that, or even the playoffs with this roster. But I think when you mentioned about believing in Jared Goff, I think they believe in him to an extent. If this would have been a different draft class and there was some top level quarterbacks in this draft instead of taking Aiden Hutchinson, I'm pretty sure they would have taken a Bryce Young or a CJ Stroud if one of those type of guys were available. This just happened to be an oddly weak quarterback class, one of the weakest ones we've seen in years. So I just think it really had more to do with who was available at that spot and just realizing, like, look, we got a veteran guy. He's decent. We can ride with Goff for another season. If the wheels come off and they're picking in the top 5 again, I would not be the least bit surprised if they go after a quarterback in this next year's class.
Yeah, and the quarterback class is really deep. But yeah, I do agree with you as well with the Lions believing him an extent. And of course, the quarterback class, there was only 1 quarterback taken in the first round. There was none in the second. I think there was like 3 in the third, but it did seem interesting that they decided to wait. But at the same time, I think too, next year, if Detroit only wins a few more games and they're once again in the position to draft a guy like Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, or even I'm assuming Spencer Rattler is going to be ranked pretty high as well. That's probably going to be somewhere in there. But let's go on to another team as well. The Carolina Panthers recently acquired Baker Mayfield. I guess it's been about a month. I'm assuming you think Mayfield's going to be the starter, but who do you think is going to be the starting quarterback in week 1 for the Panthers?
Well, I'd be surprised if it wasn't Baker Mayfield. I think the only reason you can maybe see Sam Darnold is because of the familiarity with the offense. That might be the reason he would start, but I don't see it. I think we know they moved on from Sam Darnold. They went after Baker Mayfield for a reason. But to be completely honest, I don't know if it really matters much for this team. They aren't going anywhere this year. Matt Rule is going to be coaching college football next year. I know they went, like I said, they acquired him. They've seen what Sam Darnold can do in this offense. They already know what he can do, so I don't think there's any reason to trot him back out there. But when I look at Baker Mayfield, this is a guy, yeah, he's flashed some talent. He's had some nice moments in the NFL. But really, when you look at it, he couldn't get it done with one of the top-rated offensive lines in the league, 2 stud wide receivers, 2 stud running backs, 2 stud tight ends. I mean, there's just no reason for me to think that he's going to be able to get it done with this roster in Carolina. So I have very little faith in either one of these guys. I think both of them are going to be holding clipboards after this year.
Yeah, I agree with you as well, because we didn't see a lot from Sam Darnold. I understand he had 3 it was 3 years in New York, and it was in a terrible situation, but he didn't get much of a better situation when he went to Carolina, because if Christian McCaffrey isn't 100%, which he never really is, they're in trouble, because I feel like McCaffrey's that whole team. And I know they have DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. They're solid receivers, right? But I feel like McCaffrey was that whole team. And again, we've seen the limitations of Sam Darnold. You know, Baker Mayfield, we've seen, like I said, as you mentioned, we've seen him have some flashes, but it really hasn't been to where we're like, oh, wow, this guy's a legitimate franchise quarterback. So I'll see what happens with Carolina, but I also do agree with you as well. I think Matt Rule's not going to be coaching the Panthers next year. But we also know that David Tepper is not a patient owner, right? He's, I think, had 3 or 4 different quarterbacks in 4 years, and this will probably be his next year. He'll have his third coach. So we'll see what happens with Carolina. But if they win 5 games, again, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't even be surprised if they win less than that. But speaking of another team too, this time we'll go to the AFC, the Buffalo Bills. And I know I didn't mention this. I want to talk about this a little bit, but a lot of people have the Buffalo Bills going all the way. And I like the Bills as well, but I can't see them going all the way to the Super Bowl. I think I have them winning 11 games, which people are probably going to be not happy with my prediction. But do you think the Bills go to the Super Bowl next year? And what do you think the Bills' record is this upcoming season?
Boy, it's tough. I do think the Bills are the favorites in Vegas for a reason. I think when you look at this team, they've probably got one of the best rosters in the league. You can make a case that it is the best roster in the league. They're certainly in the discussion if it's not. I think they have a really underrated coach, a guy that doesn't get talked enough about, in Sean McDermott. Josh Allen, as we know, is an elite young quarterback, one of the best in the game. He's got weapons. He's got a defense. They're deep at a lot of positions. There's not a lot of holes on this team. There's not a lot of things you can point to and say, they're not great there. I think maybe the one thing would be the running game. I think that's something they need to improve, but they drafted a running back this year. I think that they're going to try to address that more and try to get a little more balance from that offense so they don't have to rely on Josh Allen running around as much as we've seen in recent years. But I do think this team is poised to make a deep run. I'd be surprised if they didn't get in the mix for the Super Bowl. I think they're a team that anything short of an AFC Championship game would probably be viewed as a disappointment. They bring over Von Miller, a guy who's past his prime. I mean, I get that, but still can flash. We saw that with the Rams last year. He came in, gave them a spark when they really needed it most. Not the player that we saw a few years ago when he was a defensive player of the year type, but a guy that I think is still going to bring some value to this defense, and especially in some of those key moments. I think the Bills are the heavy favorite in the AFC, the AFC East. But the AFC, as we know, is deep. And this is just a loaded conference. I don't remember the last time the AFC was this daunting, and that's going to be tough. And so I think there's a big handful of teams that could easily represent the AFC, but they're certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the AFC is stacked. I mean, just look at the AFC West, right? And it's going to be tough. I think if the Bills were in the NFC, I think they would easily make it to the Super Bowl, but the AFC is just so stacked. I mean, a lot of things can happen, but I got a feeling that if the Ravens are fully healthy, like they weren't last year, I think they could be a Super Bowl team. So the Chiefs could, of course, not a lot of people are talking about the Chiefs because I think they lost more than they gained last year. And then, of course, you have teams like the Chargers, and even the Broncos could be I think they're going to make the playoffs, but they could be kind of a sleeper team that not a lot of people outside of Colin Cowherd are really mentioning, right? But we'll see there. Let's go back to the NFC for a little bit here. Jameis Winston looks a little bit banged up. If Winston isn't 100%, how much will that affect the Saints' playoff chances this season?
Well, I look at this team. Vegas has their season over/under win total at 8 games. Last I checked, I did see some books that had it at 8.5. Chances of getting into the playoffs for a team that's going to be essentially a below 500 team or close to a 500 level team, even in the NFC, like we talked about, a much easier path. It's not great already. And you mentioned the Winston injury. I've seen enough from Jameis Winston, injury or not, to know that this guy's a roller coaster quarterback. If he's healthy, I'd say maybe a 30% chance to make the playoffs. If he misses some real time, if he misses some real game time this year, I think that does drop, and maybe there are 5 to 10% chance of making the playoffs. When I look at this team, they've got a good roster. They've got a good defense. I don't trust Dennis Allen as a head coach. I've seen that before. I've seen that movie, and I've seen the movie with Jameis Winston in it as well, and I don't trust it either. So, those are the 2 big question marks, and they're at 2 of the most key parts of your team at coach and quarterback. So I'm not as high on the Saints as a lot of people. A lot of people are kind of picking them as a dark horse team in the NFC. I just don't see it. I think more than likely this is a team that misses the playoffs.
If Sean Payton was still there, and if Jameis Winston for the most part was healthy, do you think you'd give the Saints a better chance of making the playoffs?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, Sean Payton, we're talking about a guy that when he retired was probably a top 5 coach in the league, maybe a top 3 coach in the league, one of the best offensive minds in the game. He's the kind of coach that can elevate any quarterback. And we saw that for years. Not that Drew Brees wasn't great, we know that, but the combination of having a high-level quarterback with Sean Payton was incredible. And I think he could elevate any guy that he has under center. I would give them a much higher chance. That I said 30%, it'd probably be more like 50 to 60% chance
Mm-hmm.
if they had a guy like Sean Payton. I just, like I said, I don't believe in Dennis Allen. This is a guy who has already failed as a head coach. He's a defensive minded guy, and the defense will probably be fine. But now you're taking him away from that defense, and someone else is going to be calling it. Does the defense take a step back? I think there's a good chance that it could, and I don't see the offense being better with him as a head coach. So for me, it's just too many question marks. It's just not the team that we've seen a few years ago when they had that Super Bowl window there and they were in the mix. I just don't think that window is open anymore with Jameis Winston and Dennis Allen. It's a far cry from Sean Payton and Drew Brees.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you there. And I do like the receiving core that the Saints brought up. They drafted Chris Olave. They signed Jarvis Landry, which I was still amazed that that the Saints got him so late. And of course, Michael Thomas is back, but we don't know exactly how healthy Michael Thomas has played. It's crazy that I don't think he's played a full season since 2019. So the receiving core, as long as they can stay healthy, are good. But yeah, Winston is kind of a back and forth quarterback. And we all know that Taysom Hill just isn't a quarterback. He's more of just a gadget guy. But I mean, we'll see what happens with the Saints. It definitely will be entertaining to see how good they are this year, or how they kind of play in a favorable division. I mean, the Buccaneers are probably going to win that division, but at the same time, you have the Panthers and Falcons, where we both know they're not going to make the playoffs. So we'll see. But let's just stay with the NFC. Kevin O'Connell now is in his first year with the Vikings. Do you think they actually have a chance of winning that division over the Packers?
I think they have a chance. I think they're really the only team that's a real threat to
Mm-hmm.
Green Bay as far as this year. It's really hard to say. This is a team that's hard to read right now. A lot of changes in Minnesota. Vegas has them at 9.5 is their season over under win total. This is a team that went 8-9 last year. Things got a little stale with Mike Zimmer, and I understand the move. I know that they wanted to change things up. I had a Vikings insider on my podcast recently. He said that the offense is going to look really different this year. Mm-hmm. He said it's going to be more open. It's going to be more 3 and 4 wide receiver sets, less running the ball. And I think when you're taking the ball out of Dalvin Cook's hands, easily one of your best offensive weapons, maybe your best offensive weapon, and putting the ball in Kirk Cousins' hands more, I don't really like the sound of that. It doesn't sound too smart if you ask me. They had a horrendous draft, one of the worst drafts in the NFL. I didn't see they reached for a ton of guys. I don't see a lot of difference makers that they brought into this team. Not sure that this is a team that's going to win 9 or 10 games, and they're probably going to have to win at least that many to win the NFC North. I'm going to stick with Green Bay winning that division. I think the Vikings will have a nice season, but I don't see big improvement from them. Too many question marks. And like I said, I'm not sure I like the offensive philosophy, at least on paper. We'll see how it works out in the season, though.
Yeah, but I do think that Rams assistants do much better than Patriots assistants. We all know the Belichick tree has not done well, but I think the Rams or Sean McVay coaching tree has done pretty well, I believe, because I think Matt LaFleur, well, I think he was in LA for a few years. So I think Kevin O'Connell is a nice hire. We all know Mike Zimmer. There was some that he had a disconnect. Him and Kirk Cousins didn't get along a lot. I think Zimmer definitely needed a change of scenery, or at least the Vikings needed a change of scenery. But I could see them winning 10 or 11 games. I know, again, I mentioned him previously, but I think Colin Cowherd actually has the Vikings winning that division. But it's hard for me not to see the Packers win that division because of how good Aaron Rodgers has been. And we all know he owns that division. He not only owns the Bears, but he owns that complete division. So I'd like the Vikings to make the playoffs, but again, I don't know how far they're going to go. Again, the NFC, much easier path in the NFC. Do you think Kevin O'Connell was the right hire for the Vikings, though?
Well, I don't think it's a good or bad hire. I think we just haven't seen anything yet. It's just the jury's still out on him. We're going to have to see how it plays out. There's a lot of coaching hires that look great on paper and they blow up in our face. You mentioned the coaching tree, and we have seen some success from guys like that, the Matt LaFleurs of the world, and some of these guys that are kind of running that style. And Zach Taylor as well for the Bengals. Obviously, he had a lot of success, and he comes off that tree as well. So there's something to be said about that. And I understand going in a different direction and wanting to be a little more innovative on offense. And I understand as well that it's a quarterback game more than it ever has been. I'm just not sure Kirk Cousins is the guy. He's not a terrible quarterback by any means. I'm just not sure that putting pressure on him to push the ball down the field and take chances is really not something he does well. And that's something they're going to want him to do in this offense. And I just don't know if that bodes well for the Vikings this year. I think they have a decent roster. Like I said, terrible draft. I didn't like any of the picks they made. I really don't think that they improved this team at all in the offseason. So it's just hard to say. I think it's a big question mark team. It's probably one of the hardest teams to get a read on. Like I said, 9.5 over under. I'll take the under on that one. I think this is a team that's probably still going to be 8 or 9 wins at best, but it wouldn't surprise me because, like you said, the NFC is pretty weak. The division's fairly weak outside of Green Bay. So maybe they surprise some people and become a wild card team. Wouldn't shock me.
Mm-hmm. And let's stay in the NFC North. We mentioned this before we started recording, but Roquan Smith wants out of Chicago, and he's not very happy with the organization. If Roquan Smith does get traded, what team do you think fits Roquan Smith the best, or where do you think he would thrive the most outside of Chicago?
Boy, that's tough. This is a guy who really had a big time year last year. He's kind of an under the radar player as far as from a national perspective. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. Pretty good athlete, a guy that could probably play in a lot of different systems. I'm not sure he would thrive in a 3-4. I think you're going to have to look for a team with a 4-3 defense that needs leadership on that side of the ball. Off the top of my head, it's about the money too, though, because he's going to want veteran money, of course. So it's hard to say. I would have to look up who's got cap space, who has a hole at that position, but probably a team, they probably want to get him out of that division, of course, and they probably ideally like to get him in the AFC as well. So you're probably looking at a team like with a 4-3 defense, maybe Miami, a team like that. Hard to say what happens there, though.
Yeah, and you mentioned the AFC. I think there was a few teams reportedly, like you said, the Dolphins. I think the Patriots and Ravens and Broncos have been linked to Roquan Smith. Do you think a team like the Ravens, who didn't do a whole lot this offseason, and do you think they could use a guy like Roquan Smith?
Yeah, I think it would definitely fit as far as his style of play and what they like to do in Baltimore. They're usually not the team to make a splashy free agent move, though. This is the team that drafts extremely well and kind of builds up from the farm system, so to speak. They kind of have their own way of doing it, and like I said, they rarely make those kind of moves. I don't see a team like that making that kind of move. You'd probably expect it more from a team that thinks that they're a player or two away from a Super Bowl. And the Ravens kind of fit that bill. I think they're a team that maybe is closer to being a Super Bowl team than people realize. I just don't think they're the type of team that spends money and makes those kind of moves. I think they believe in their guys. They believe in developing the talent they have. So it would be surprising. I think it would fit on paper, so to speak, but I couldn't imagine the Ravens actually doing it.
And let's go on to another first-year coach. Doug Peterson is with Jacksonville. How many games do you think the Jaguars will win this year with Doug Peterson? Because I feel like they're going to win more than 3 games.
Yeah, I think this is a team that they're poised to make a big leap. They're actually one of the teams that I think people need to watch for in circle, so to speak, in 2022. This team could be a team that goes from back-to-back first overall picks to a team that probably wins 6 or 7 games this year and really surprises some people. I think Trevor Lawrence is obviously the big starting point for them. I think he should take a big step forward as well. It really can't be overstated just how big of a dumpster fire Urban Meyer was last year for this team and the instability that it created for this franchise. Peterson comes in, former quarterback, a proven NFL head coach. They added some nice pieces in the draft and in free agency. So they've upgraded the roster as well. I just have a hard time thinking that this team doesn't at least take a step forward. I'd be surprised if they didn't win at least 5 or 6 games and maybe a few more than that.
Well, yeah, well, they're kind of in a favorable division like Detroit because the AFC South, I mean, the AFC South doesn't really have a dominant team. I think the Colts are ultimately going to win that division now that they have an established quarterback. Now, I said last year the Colts were going to win the division. I was completely wrong about Carson Wentz, but I think I could see the Jaguars winning 6 games, but I feel like they could maybe. I mean, I think they're going to be better than the Texans because I got a feeling that the Texans might be the worst team in the league next year or this upcoming season. But 6 games sounds about right for the Jaguars. I do think they paid a little bit. I think they overpaid for Christian Kirk, right? But I feel like that team has a very can actually, show improvement. I think Travis Etienne is going to be a solid player, as long as he can stay healthy. And, Trevor Lawrence, the number one pick, one of the best recruits at one time, or he was the number one recruit at one time. So I think, I could see the Jaguars winning 6 games. I could also see him winning more, but I definitely think I agree with you because Doug Peterson has won a Super Bowl. He's a proven head coach. I think the Jaguars can definitely make that leap that, some people are predicting and, as you mentioned. So another thing too, the New England Patriots don't have an offensive coordinator. And I thought this was very interesting that they're going to have Matt Patricia and Joe Judge basically be their offensive coordinators, where I think they're both splitting plays. And Patricia is a defensive coordinator, a former defensive coordinator, and Joe Judge is a former special teams coordinator. They both tried to be head coaches in the league and ultimately failed. What are your thoughts on the Patriots, having 2 non-offensive coordinators call their plays on offense?
Absolute disaster. I can't see this going any other way. I think this is going to be a dumpster fire. Losing a guy like Josh McDaniels was massive. I don't think people realize how important of a role he had on this team. One of the best offensive coordinators in the NFL. Now you're going to bring in, like you said, a former defensive coordinator and a former special teams coach to call and design the offense for a young quarterback in his second year, no less. Now, Belichick is a guy who's known for cross-training his assistants, so to speak, to learn both sides of the ball. I get that. He's got a coaching staff that they do it a little bit differently than most other staffs. But this still feels like a big reach. I'm not high on the New England Patriots this year, and this is the number one reason why. Now, they lost some key players. They also had a pretty iffy draft as well, so I don't think they're bringing in a lot of talent. But this storyline is mind-blowing to me. I really don't see how this is going to work. Like you said, 2 guys that failed miserably as head coaches, have really no experience in calling plays, designing plays. I can't see this going well. I'd be shocked. Bill Belichick, we know he's the greatest of all time. Maybe he makes us all look stupid here, but I have a hard time thinking that this doesn't go sideways for New England.
Well, I mean, there's reports all over, Twitter and just all over the NFL world where Mac Jones is struggling. He doesn't feel comfortable. And it's because he doesn't have an offensive minded coach. I mean, I thought it was a dumb idea too, because both Patricia and Joe Judge, I didn't think Patricia was that good of a defensive coordinator because I think when he was D coordinator, I think, Belichick was calling the plays, right? Or calling the defensive plays. And Joe Judge, he's a special teams guy. So, I mean, I just don't understand it either. I mean, I could see Mac Jones struggling a lot this year. Do you think Mac Jones will struggle as well, or?
Well, he surprised me last year. I think he surprised a lot of us. I wasn't very high on him coming out of the draft, and he came out and played really well and had a really nice rookie season and really showed New England fans that maybe they've got a guy who could be a franchise quarterback. It's hard to think that this isn't going to derail that progress, though, because I'm with you. When you're mixing things up, especially for a young quarterback, this is going to be really tough. It's tough when a young quarterback has to change offensive coordinators in year 2, even when you bring in an experienced offensive coordinator. But now you're bringing in 2 guys that have never done it, and they're kind of learning on the job as well. It just, nothing about this feels right. Nothing about it sounds right. I think it's going to be a rocky year for New England. I think this is a year where they're really going to come down to earth.
And yeah, you're talking about the AFC East. I think we all know it's the Bills division, right? But the Dolphins got much better this year. I could see the Patriots getting 3rd and completely missing the playoffs just because, it depends how much, because I think that the Patriots are going to be a defensive team. They, for the most part, have been a defensive team under Belichick, but I've got a feeling that they might be the 3rd best team and might not have another winning record. I could see them easily only winning 7 or 8 games this year. And I don't exactly know their schedule, but I think their schedule is a little tougher since they did make the playoffs last year. So We'll see what happens. I don't think I mentioned this, and I forgot to talk about this a few minutes ago, but which second-year quarterback will make the biggest leap this season?
Well, we talked about him. For me, it's Trevor Lawrence. I think just mostly because, like I mentioned, he's in a much better situation. His rookie year was a massive disappointment, a guy that came in with huge, huge expectations, one of the highest graded, most highly regarded prospects of really in a long time, probably since Andrew Luck. You probably have to go back 10 years before we had a quarterback prospect that felt like a home run as much as this kid did. He had a season that was quite forgettable for most, 17 interceptions, only 12 touchdowns. The wide receiver group has been upgraded as well. So, like we talked about, new coach, new situation, some new weapons around him. You mentioned Travis Etienne. He's back from that injury as well, former Clemson teammate. That's going to give him a spark, I think, in the running game. He's also a really good pass catcher out of the backfield. I have a hard time thinking that Lawrence isn't going to take a big step forward. Now, I don't think he's going to be necessarily Pro Bowl level or, blow people away and show him why we should get his gold jacket ready just yet. But I do think that this is the guy that's going to show everybody that he is going to develop into a solid starting quarterback in year 2, something that we didn't see in year 1.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Now then, when the after the 2021 draft, I said, and this might end up, being a huge blow up in my face, but I really like Trey Lance. I don't think he'll have a great season this year, but I think Trevor Lawrence will have the best year for all the quarterbacks, like as you mentioned. But I think at the end of the day, in my opinion, the most excited quarterback for the second years was I want to see what Trey Lance does. I really liked him coming out of college. However, according to sources, he hasn't had the best season. And of course, last year he couldn't even beat out Jimmy Garoppolo. But I like Trey Lance a lot, but I wouldn't be surprised too if Trevor Lawrence had the best season of all the second-year quarterbacks, because I think Justin Fields and Mac Jones are going to struggle again this year. I think Justin Fields, the Bear situation is just a total mess, as we just were mentioning about Roquan Smith. So we'll see what happens there. And another guy too that has demanded a trade, Kareem Hunt of the Browns. The Browns have so much distraction right now with the old Deshaun Watson news. They traded Mayfield, and now they have another big story where Kareem Hunt has demanded a trade. Do you think Hunt will be traded, or do you think he'll get a new contract, or what do you think the future holds for Kareem Hunt?
Well, you look at the situation. He signed a 2-year extension in 2020. He's coming off a season where he only played 8 games. He's 27 and he's under contract. If he sits out, he's going to lose money. You don't pay a 27-year-old running back after an injury, and you don't trade them either. So I don't see him getting his way here. 27 is not old, but let's face it, his best football is probably behind him at this point. His prime has probably only got a year or 2 left. So why would you pay this guy when you already have him under contract? It doesn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah.
If you're smart, you just tell him, hey, you're under contract. You're going to play for us or nobody else. But the Browns aren't smart. This is a franchise that makes bad decisions and has made bad decisions for a long time. So who knows? Maybe they bend to his will and they end up moving him. I'd be surprised though. I don't think it's a very smart move to move him at this point. So yeah, I don't see it happening, but like I said, it's the Browns. If this was a better ran organization, there'd be no doubt in my mind that they would just tell him, hey, too bad. But with knowing the Browns, who knows what'll happen? They'll probably trade him to the Ravens or the Steelers and they'll blow up in their face.
I would love to be traded. I would love for Kareem Hunt to be traded to the Ravens, because being a Lamar Jackson fan, I feel like Kareem Hunt would do great in that offense and that team, and definitely getting to get revenge on the Browns twice a year would be great. But speaking of the Browns, as you all know, or as you know, and most people know, that, they acquired Deshaun Watson in March. Originally, he was suspended for 6 games, but the NFL has now appealed the suspension, and I think he can still technically play unless the NFL rules him out. Do you think he'll play at all this season, or when do you think he'll actually suit up in a regular season game for the Browns?
To answer your question, no, I don't think he's going to play this season. I said before the 6-game suspension came out, I had been saying for a while on my podcast that I don't think there's any way he plays this year. I just can't see it. I think the NFL is going to move mountains to see that he doesn't play this year. He's been dragging the Shield through the mud for a while now. He has caused a lot of bad PR for this league. And the NFL and Roger Goodell, behind closed doors, they are furious about this situation. They are furious about the 6-game suspension. They are going to do everything in their power to keep him off the field this year. I just see no way that he plays this year. It would be shocking. And I know it's a different game nowadays as far as the way they rule things, and it's a lot different than the days when Roger Goodell was calling all the shots. But with that being said, I just can't imagine the NFL not pushing back and doing everything in their power to keep him off the field. I think the next time we see him is the following season. I don't think there's a chance he plays this year.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised either because we all knew the NFL wanted him to be suspended for the entire year. So when you heard that Sue Robinson was only going to suspend him for 6 games, I think most people, even the casual football fan knew that he was likely going to be suspended for a lot longer. And he wasn't fined, which I thought was interesting. But I think he's going to end up getting fined. I agree with you. I don't think he plays at all this season. I don't know when the ruling from Peter C. Harvey is going to be because he's the attorney that's handling this now after they appealed Sue Robinson's decision. So I agree with you as well. I think Deshaun Watson's not going to play at all this season. I think the NFL too wants to, they made not the best decision with Ray Rice about 9-10 years ago. And I think they want to get a second chance to where they can suspend Watson for the entire season. So I agree with you as well. I don't think he plays at all this year. I think he'll also be fined. And I think the Browns might not be great this year because I don't know if they will. I think they might win 7 or 8 games, but especially with a tough division. And Jacoby Brissett's a nice quarterback, but is he good enough to lead them to the playoffs? Probably not, especially in a loaded division and a loaded conference. So again, thanks again for coming on, Brad. We're starting to run out of time here, but before we end the interview, do you have a Super Bowl prediction?
Well, it feels early for Super Bowl, but I'll do it anyway because it's a lot of fun. We all do it right. So let's go Bills, Bucks. I know you said you're not picking the Bills, and quite frankly, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Bills don't get there just because the AFC is so loaded this year. It could really be, like we said earlier, it could be a big basket of teams that could come out of the AFC. I just think when I look at this team, Vegas has the Bills as the heavy favorite for a reason. Hard to find holes in this roster. Great quarterback, great team. I think they're definitely going to be in the mix. That's going to be my AFC pick. It's kind of chalky. I get it, but usually the chalk is what ends up there. So with the Bucks on the other side, also one of the best rosters in the game, a team that you really have a hard time finding holes on this roster. Brady came back for one reason and one reason only. And if he didn't think that they could win the Super Bowl, he wouldn't be here today. I think this team in the NFC especially has a really good chance of getting back there. I think the Rams are going to take a step back this year. The injury to Matt Stafford, I think, is a lot worse than the Rams are trying to lead on. And plus, we don't see teams repeat very often for a reason or even get back to the Super Bowl very often for a reason. So I think the Rams take a step back. The Packers, I think they take a step back after losing Devontae Adams, arguably the best receiver in the game. And there's really not a whole lot of contenders left in the NFC to really compete with the Bucs. So I'd be surprised if they didn't make a deep run. So that's going to be my picks.
I agree with you with the NFC. I think the Buccaneers, if you really think about it in the NFC, there's only really 3 contenders, and that's the Buccaneers, Rams, and Packers. In the NFC East, I think the Eagles do win the division, but I can't see them after winning I can see them winning a playoff game, but not anything after that. And I think the Buccaneers are easily going to go. I know right now Tom Brady has got some personal issues, so he's going to be out for a little bit. But we all knew he wasn't going to play the preseason. He doesn't really need to play the preseason, especially with how good he played last year, despite being 44. He's 45 now. He's only getting better with age, which is just crazy. But I do agree. I agree with you. I think the Buccaneers are going to make it to the Super Bowl. For the AFC, I think the Bills win their division, and I feel like they get one of the top 2, top 3 seeds. But if the Ravens, and I know I'm a big Lamar Jackson fan, but if the Ravens can stay healthy and the receiving core is very shaky, I understand. But I think Rashad Bateman needs to I think the Ravens are expecting Rashad Bateman to take that next step and make a big leap. So I'm going to predict the Ravens, again, if they stay fully healthy. So I'm going to go, like you said, the Bucks and Bills. I'm going to go with the Rams and Buccaneers. But again, thanks for coming on, Brad. Is there anything else you want to mention about your podcast or about the season or anything that we didn't mention before we end the interview?
Well, fired up for football, just like you guys. And it's a lot of fun to get on here and talk about the games coming up here soon. A lot of fun to talk ball with you. And thanks for having me on the show again. If you guys want to check out my show at all, it's Pint Glass Football Podcast. It's a weekly NFL and college football show, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, all the typical players where you can find podcasts. And thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, again, thanks for coming on, Brad. Again, all the links of the Pint Glass Football Podcast will be down in the description below. And again, Brad, as I mentioned to everybody, enjoy the football season, and have a rest of your night. Have a good weekend, and enjoy some preseason action, which is starting tonight. So, yep, definitely enjoy it.
You too, buddy.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Town Podcast, or the STP Pod for short. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and much more. Also, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Sports Town Podcast. If you want to check out more videos of the Sports Town Podcast, click on the right.